It is Royal Spartan 125, and this time I will be reacting to what if Nazi Germany fought the Vietnam War? I better say the Second World War. The Vietnam War. Sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me today. But yeah, I almost said the Second World War. They did fight the Second World War. That's the problem. Uh, what if they fought Vietnam War? Now remember to share these videos on social media because I don't know how to use social media that much. I'm in my 40s, you know what I mean? I'm just not into that social stuff, social media stuff. And if you guys know about social media, share it on social media. Tell everyone about it. This is the only way my channel is going to grow. I'm going to say same thing on my other channel, my movie reaction channel too. Because I'd like this stuff to grow and get bigger, and I am trying. We'll see how it goes. Okay, there's no point talking about it because I'd rather just get to the reaction. So let's jump it. Yeah. Here we go.
The Vietnam War was a conflict fought from around 1955 until 1975 between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, supported by the USA. The war was won by North Vietnam. The US forces, demoralized by domestic opposition, withdrew by 1972. Saigon was captured in 1975, and this was the end of the war. But what would have happened if this conflict had been fought by the Germans instead of Americans? Would it have been the same? Who would have won?
I think it probably would have ended around about the same, because I'd say the Nazis would have been as powerful as the US is now, maybe slightly more. But you take it the Nazis would have had to win the Second World War, right, to survive. So they would have been trying to rebuild for years and years. And they'd probably be more powerful than what the US is not, right? I would say so. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. It could be the same, but maybe there would have been no conflict. Who knows? Well, would the Germans have got involved? Another question. But they're in it. That's all. Now we're trying to decide whether or not they would win or not. I don't know. Honestly, I think it would probably end right about the same way. You know?
The story starts in December 1941. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The USA declares war on Japan. But Hitler and Mussolini did not declare war on the USA, so the USA was never directly involved in the war in Europe. What happens now? In the Pacific, the war between the USA and Japan ends with an American victory. US forces invaded Japan in 1946, using another 9 atomic bombs, apart from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in Europe, without a direct American intervention, things would be different. No landing in Normandy, no Operation Torch in North Africa. The Italians are able to hold on in Libya. No American bombings. The Soviets are stopped in Ukraine. The war became a gigantic and costly stalemate, and in May 1946 there was a peace conference in Paris that ended the conflict. Germany is the real winner of the war in Europe. Since the Axis occupy most of Europe, Germany obtains lands in the east, Luxembourg and part of Alsace. Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states are placed into the German sphere of influence, as they were under the Soviet influence in our timeline. Italy gains lands in Yugoslavia. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Finland, and Norway have pro-Axis governments. Spain, too, is close to the Axis. In Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the pre-war governments are restored. Yugoslavia is dismembered. In the Soviet Union, Stalin is overthrown and executed in 1947. Now Khrushchev is the first secretary. Japan loses all of their foreign territories. No Soviet intervention in Manchuria, so Korea is united under American influence. The Chinese Civil War ends with Mao's victory in 1950. Decolonization is slowed. In 1960, Europeans still have their African colonies. The world is divided into three blocks: the Communist Bloc, the Soviet Union, and China. The Axis in Europe, the Allies led by the United States of America and the United Kingdom. A Cold War between the three blocs soon begins.
Hey, this is interesting. I like this idea. You know? It's very much the same as our world, except for the Axis. You know? They have a lot more influence and all. And yeah, so instead of a European Union, you have the Axis, right? But from the start, like from the end of the Second World War. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. It is.
In the following years, Germany became the second world power after the USA. By 1960, the Kriegsmarine has 8 aircraft carriers. In terms of naval power projection, Germany has the second largest navy, with the US being largely the number 1. Germany and Italy still maintain their World War II battleships and heavy cruisers. German aircraft carriers have a displacement of 33 to 55,000 tons. Germany challenges American supremacy in all spheres, like China does in our timeline. In South America, several countries have strong relationships with the Axis. But Germany has to face the discontent in the eastern countries, and the Soviets are still in the east, armed, dangerous, and eager to take revenge. For this reason, Germany has to maintain one of the largest armies in the world, with the best equipment, training, and armored vehicles. In France, after the death of Pétain in 1951, Pierre Laval, with the German support, becomes the prime minister with complete control. They too lost part of their empire, but maintained Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Indochina. December 1947. In Vietnam, a war begins between French forces and the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. In May 1954, the French are decisively defeated at Dien Bien Phu and start to leave Indochina. Vietnam is temporarily cut in half. Ho Chi Minh controls North Vietnam. The south is under Bao Dai, the Vietnamese emperor. But France has strong ties with Germany, and the German headquarters have the same idea as the CIA and the Americans had in our timeline: bring part of French Indochina under their control.
Yeah, I was thinking this would happen. Yeah, because France and Germany have strong ties. Germany would start to think, "Oh, we can take that part that was the French region and take control." Right? We can just say, "Oh, we'll take it off your hands." Yeah, we'll take that part off your hands, and you won't have to worry about it anymore. And the French would be like, "Oh, great, thanks, okay." Maybe they give them like reparations or something, you know, to like payments or whatever to walk away and let the Germans have it, possibly. I don't know. Maybe the French will be happy to get rid of it. Possibly.
Bring part of French Indochina under their control. The 67-year-old Hitler is aware that if Germany wants to remain a world power and overcome America, they need to extend their influence all around the planet. Vietnam, and possibly Laos and Cambodia, become essential to expand the Axis power in Asia. More importantly, Hitler doesn't want to let Indochina fall to his mortal enemy, the Communist Soviet Union. October 1955. The Germans are on the move. The South Vietnamese Prime Minister Ngo Ninh Diem deposes Emperor Bao Dai. The Germans support the South Vietnam government with supplies, weapons, and military advisors. November 5th, 1955. Diem declares South Vietnam to be an independent state, with himself as president. Soon, the Viet Minh from North Vietnam initiate a guerrilla war in the South Vietnam. North Vietnam is heavily backed by the Soviet Union and China. The USA is non-interventionist and not involved in this area. For the moment, they are neutral. In 1956 and the following years, the frequency of Viet Cong guerrilla attacks continues to rise. The quality of South Vietnamese military is poor, with poor leadership. The Viet Cong tactics are harsh, brutal, and effective. The German
Yikes.
headquarters know that it's only a matter of time before the South Vietnamese government crashes. It is corrupt, unstable, and inefficient. Hitler orders to increase the German military presence. 12,000 other German Special Force soldiers and security advisors are sent to Vietnam. Some of the best German Waffen-SS units are moved to Saigon. By 1959, the German military presence in South Vietnam is raised to 90,000 military personnel and advisors. 3 German carriers, the old Graf Zeppelin, the Danzig, and the Hermann Göring, are deployed near the Vietnamese coast. The German support, however, is limited to artillery and airstrikes. The Luftwaffe in Vietnam is initially based in Da Nang. The commander of the German Expeditionary Corps is General Michael Wittmann. During the Second World War, he was a Waffen-SS tank commander. He is a very experienced general. He fought in almost all the German post-World War II wars. He was in the Expeditionary Army in Persia against the communist guerrilla who spread in the country after the retirement of the Soviets in 1947. In 1952, he was in Warsaw during the Polish Uprising, and in 1954, he was in Algeria to crush the revolt in the Neue Afrika Korps at French side.
March 2, 1960, Gulf of Tonkin. The German destroyer Krakow, on mission along the North Vietnamese coast, is attacked by 3 North Vietnamese boats with torpedoes and machine gun fire. Whitman orders the retaliation. From the aircraft carriers, 90 FW-605 fighter bomber strikes on the barracks at Viet Thu Lu and Dong Hoi, home of the 325th Infantry Division, with rockets and 150 kilograms bombs. The Viet Cong logistics and communications near the border are bombed.
Yikes.
In 1960, North Vietnam has no aircraft fighters. The Me-464 protect the attack force, strafing the anti-aircraft positions. The Messerschmitt Me-464 is the main fighter of the Luftwaffe, as was the Bf-109 during the Second World War. It's the best fighter of the time. In reaction to this 5-day strike campaign, the Viet Congs attacks a hotel in Kim Yun, killing 23 German servicemen. March 13th, in the night, Hitler sends a message to Whitman, ordering him to take all necessary measures to repel any attack against the German personnel, and to prevent further aggressions.
This voice we're listening to sounds a little bit more robotic at the moment. I didn't notice it at first, but now I do. It's starting to... What do you think? How real do you think this would be? Is this the way you think it would go? Is it? I mean, I know there are people out there that know a lot more about this stuff than I ever will. Is this the way you would think it would go? With Nazis, with the Nazi Germany fighting the Vietnam War? Certainly, it's an interesting concept. I said that before, but how close are they to what you think would be reality?
March 13th, in the night, Hitler sends a message to Whitman, ordering him to take all necessary measures to repel any attack against the German personnel, and to prevent further aggressions. The first order of Whitman is the mining of the North Vietnamese port of Haiphong, to impede the arrival of the Soviet aids. Then, the 5th Panzer Division is sent right up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is the lifeline of the Viet Congs. Someone told about the limited usefulness of armored tanks in a jungle environment, but they told the same in the Ardennes. However, in this situation the tanks serve largely as infantry support, and mobile artillery pieces. In 1960, the main tank of the Germans is the Jaguar Heavy Tank, or Panzer IX, German official designation, Panzerkampfwagen Jaguar, SD.KFC 403. The Jaguar tank is 9 meters long, 72 tons, main armament a 152 mm gun. The secondary armament is a 20 mm gun, and a 7.62 mm NG3 machine gun.
Tell you what, it doesn't look like there's a lot of room in that tank. And I knew that the tanks were like compressed spaces, but wow. 3 guys just sort of having to sit that close to each other. That's crazy. Very, very confined, very hard to work in those conditions. I suppose when you're trained to it, it's like second nature.
The secondary armament is a 20 mm gun, and a 7.62 mm NG3 machine gun. The Germans have other type of tanks. There are the first Leopard, and even an upgraded version of the old Panzer V Panther is still in use. The German uniforms and helmets in Vietnam are similar to those used in our timeline at the end of the war, in fronts like France and Italy. There is no reason to change them. The American soldiers in Vietnam too had similar uniform to those used in World War II. The MG machine gun would be in Vietnam too. An unrestricted air bombing campaign over North Vietnam begins. The German He-507 strategic heavy bombers drop 500 kilograms bombs. The He-507 is a heavy bomber built by Heinkel, 50 meters long, with a range of 15,000 kilometers, is capable to reach Vietnam even from German air bases. It could carry 28,000 kilograms of bombs. The first Luftwaffe heavy bomber was the 4-engines America bomber Me-264, that the Germans started to use at the end of 1944. It was able to bomb the Soviet factories behind the Urals, and could reach the USA East Coast. Some military analysts think that one of the reasons USA did not declare war on Germany in 1946, after the elimination of Japan, was because the presence of this aircraft that could hit New York. The V-4s hit Hanoi. The V-4 are ballistic missiles derived from the V-2 missiles, but are smaller, 9 meters high, more precise, a range of 400 kilometers, and a warhead of 1,000 kilograms. In our timeline, the Americans never did an unrestricted bombing campaign over Vietnam because of the restraints imposed by Cold War exigencies and by the public opinion. The Germans don't have these problems. The German public opinion overwhelmingly supports the war. There are no anti-war protests, part thanks to a different culture, and part because the Germans control news and images about the Vietnam. Foreign reporters and mass media are not allowed. USA too had means to manipulate the crowd, but Hollywood is less efficient, and YouTube and Facebook were not on the field yet.
See, I never thought of that, right? Restraints were imposed by the Cold War. Exegesis, yeah? So America wasn't able to release its full yield. Like go in there and do what it had to do. As I said, the Germans don't have that problem, yeah? And they control the media, control images, they control all of that. Their press isn't as free as the American press was. So yeah, that's how they're gonna win. That's why people are behind them in Germany. You know, they can control the narrative in their own country and around the world. Yeah, so that's crazy. Yeah, they're winning the information war at least, right? And they don't have to hold back at all.
There are several losses in the Luftwaffe. Supported by their communist allies, North Vietnam fields a good mixture of anti-aircraft weapons, from missiles to 37mm guns. But the Luftwaffe has the total control of the sky, and can inflict great damage to North Vietnam forces.
March 27, 1960. Whitman gives the order. At dawn, 180,000 German soldiers and around 250,000 men of the South Vietnam Army cross the North Vietnamese border. Operation Collar Mongo, the invasion of North Vietnam, begins. The German advance is rapid. Dong Hoi is taken after 3 days. There are landings at Quang Dong, Kua Lo. The Germans utilize a blitzkrieg-style invasion using Jaguar tanks supported by artillery and aircraft. The People's Army of Vietnam have no methods in stopping the onslaught of tanks as they lack efficient anti-tank weapons and have no tanks at all. Vietnamese cities fall one after the other. Vinh, Tao Ho, Nam Dinh. April 25th, the port of Haiphong is taken. USA Army 2 could have invaded North Vietnam, but they never did it. Too many complicated domestic political blunders, restrictions on the US Army, and pacifist movements, something that lacks in Germany. Then the Americans feared to draw the Soviets or the Chinese or both into the war. The Americans remembered what happened in Korea and didn't want to repeat the experience. Conversely, the Germans in their history never avoided to invade a country fearing the draw of other powers into the war. The Americans in Vietnam were fighting a defensive battle to protect the South. They took ground, often at a great loss, only to be told to abandon it shortly thereafter. But wars are won by taking and then holding ground. This is the way that wars are won for millennia, and this is what the Wehrmacht are doing.
Yeah, so United States, he said they lost a lot of people, like trying to take ground. Then shortly after that, they'd leave it again, and that's why they didn't win, because they just wouldn't keep the ground they took, They weren't able to. I seriously doubt that, though. Like they didn't want to keep it. They wanted to show they could take it and pull back. It doesn't make much sense. I mean, obviously it's like a political, like you said, they're having political and social problems. All these anti-war groups and things. Different cultures, different peoples, and also the Germans are controlling all the information again. So yeah.
This is the way that wars are won for millennia, and this is what the Wehrmacht are doing. The German advance continues. In South Vietnam, 15,000 Viet Cong are cut off. They rely on ambushes and small unit tactics to face a disproportionate German technological advantage, but they cannot stop the German advance. The main problem for the Axis were never the partisans. For sure the Viet Cong are good warriors, the Russians were too, but it was the T-34 tank that drove back the Germans during World War II, not the partisan. Part of the North Vietnamese troops melted into the mountains in the west near the Laos border, from where they launched guerrilla raids on the German forces spread out on the coasts. The German reaction was harsh. Many villages hiding resistance are slaughtered. The South Vietnam police executes everyone suspected to be sympathetic to communism. There are severe violations of the laws of war, but wars are never fair. Wars are never right or good. If you want to win, prepare to play dirty. May 2nd, 1960. The Germans are at the gates of Hanoi.
There are international reactions to the German attack. All the German allies support the invasion. Italy, Spain, Hungary, and Romania even send expeditionary corps.
The Soviets are waiting for the events. They send more and more supplies but made it clear that Soviet land forces themselves will not directly intervene. The USSR in this timeline is actually more liberal. The relationship with China is not so warm, and an intervention in Vietnam would only help the Chinese. The Sino-Soviet split is already in the air. The Soviet bloc was nothing of the kind. The USA started an anti-German propaganda campaign, exaggerating the damages to civilians, showing the perception of a superpower attempting to bomb a smaller, agrarian society into submission. The American President Douglas MacArthur, elected in 1952 thanks to his popularity after the war in the Pacific, he was the main supporter of the atomic bomb on Japan, and would love to help Germany. He sees Germany as the main rival enemy, not the communists. Also, the German presence in Asia is not a good idea, with the close proximity to US allies. But the American public opinion have an aversion to overseas military involvement since the end of World War II. Too many losses during the invasion of Japan, when hundreds of kamikazes crashed down on anti-landing craft, deposing troops on Japanese beaches, making Operation Overlord in our timeline looking as a Sunday school picnic.
That makes sense. Why would you want to fight someone else's war? The American public don't want to get involved in the Korean or in the Vietnam War timeline because it's nothing to do with that. It's like the Israel-Gaza conflict or the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to send land troops in because it's nothing to do with them, really. At least not yet, anyway. It's on supplies and things, weapons, tanks and stuff like that there. Yeah, they'll support them in that way. But they don't want to send land troops, because they don't want to get involved. Not really. They'll bolster up, they'll recruit, train soldiers, and they'll build weapons and tanks and things, but they don't want to get involved if they don't have to, you know? Which makes sense.
Making Operation Overlord in our timeline looking as a Sunday school picnic. The Americans are not interested in a war in Vietnam. Most of them don't even know where Vietnam exactly is.
Exactly.
Despite avoiding direct involvement, the United States start to aid North Vietnam with materials, supplies, and even weapons. The Vietnam War becomes a proxy war between the Axis powers versus the Communist bloc. China and the Soviets and the tacit Western allies, United States of America, United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada. Japan. The 1 versus 1 war against the United States of America ended in 1946 with a defeat, great devastations, and an extremely high civilian death toll. The US occupation was harsh in the first years, but the US in the end was forced into dealing with conservative elements of the Japanese military and business communities to keep them from being influenced by the Axis. The United States included Japan in the Marshall Plan, securing its loyalty to the Western Alliance. The US still had military bases in Japan, and Japan is now democratized, but it did not become a pacifist nation. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were never disbanded, and are now active partners of the US against the Axis and Communists.
Oh.
President Sukarno of Indonesia with his Nationalist Independence Party is pro-Germany, from who he receives aid from since 1950. India, United Korea, Burma, and Thailand, although United States allied, prefer to have a Germanic Vietnam to balance out the pressure from the Communist China threat, the biggest threat in the long run. For the Chinese, the quick German advance was a surprise. Through neutral country diplomats, China warned that in safeguarding Chinese national security, they would intervene against Germany and Vietnam. Hitler dismissed the communication as a provocation.
May 10, 1960. Operation Stern, the attack to Hanoi, is ready. The South Vietnamese troops have the task to enter Hanoi, while the 24th Army Corps and the German 2nd SS Panzer Corps of General Mollenkamp will envelop the city. The morale in the Wehrmacht is high. Most of the soldiers heard that the city is their final objective in the war, and once taken they would leave Vietnam. North Vietnamese leadership and what remains of their forces have already withdrawn to the mountains near the Chinese border. Hanoi, already in ruins after days of carpet bombing, is taken after 3 days of battle. The German newspapers have triumphant headlines. The Asian Moscow has fallen. Der Krieg ist vorbei. Hitler congratulates Wittmann, promoting him to Field Marshal.
Nice.
The German forces advance north with little opposition.
So, for all intents and purposes, at the moment, Germany has won. Right? That's... I mean, that's what it looks like, anyway. Doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. Somebody could intervene, and, who knows, yeah? Let's find out. Ooh.
The German forces advance north with little opposition. The People's Liberation Army are moving their best trained and equipped units toward the south since March. German aerial reconnaissance has difficulty sighting Chinese units. The Chinese units only march dark to dark, and during daylight the soldiers remained motionless if an aircraft appeared until it flew away. Chinese officers were under order to shoot violators. There was resistance among many military leaders to confront the Germans in Vietnam, but Mao strongly supported an intervention. China already has the Soviets at the northern border, the USA and Korea. India is not friendly, and a German army at the gate in the south is not in his dreams. Mao appointed Wang Zhen as commander in the Chinese forces in Indochina. Wang Zhen has an interesting story. If you have 3 minutes, I'll tell you. If not, skip to 20 minutes and 10 seconds. Wang was born in 1908. His first job at age 16 was an assistant in a railroad station, but he was dismissed after slapping the wife of a foreign manager at the railroad.
Oh!
Wang joined the Communist Party of China in 1927 at age 19. He took part in the 1934 Long March. During the Second World War, he fought the Japanese. In 1942, Mao appointed Wang to head a rectification of communist writers. He responded by citing his lack of schooling. Mao responded that it's just someone without much education that I want to deal with these cultural people. In 1950, he was head of the military government in Xinjiang and gained a reputation for brutality towards the Muslim Uyghurs. He wrote to Mao Zedong that they were a troublemaking minority and suggested that they be thoroughly wiped out to avoid any future problems.
Sheesh.
Mao thought this was too extreme, and Wang was redeployed. Wang Zhen was only one of 2 Chinese commanders who authorized to carry guns when visiting Mao. May 22nd, 1960. After a heavy artillery barrage, Wang orders 500,000 Chinese troops to cross the Vietnamese border. China has entered the war.
Ooh.
In the west, 3 Chinese armies seized Lao Cai, forcing the German 24th Division to retreat. They are veterans, but the Chinese are a human wave. 4 armies take Cao Bang. 2 Chinese armies wipe out the few South Vietnamese forces near Lang Son. The German headquarters was not prepared for the attack. Vietmin believed that near the Vietnamese border, the Chinese only had some 100,000 soldiers and prohibits any retreat. But the Chinese continues to progress southwards. On June 11th, the Chinese 13th Army Group attacks and overran the South Vietnamese 2nd Corps, inflicting heavy losses. The Chinese are now at 20 kilometers from Hanoi. Vietmin is furious. His troops are even lacking supplies and fuel due to this unscheduled attack in the South Vietnam.
Oh boy. Wow. Okay, that was quick. And they'd almost won as well, damn it. Well, they had pretty much won, you know? Against North Vietnam, anyway. That's crazy, though. So, yeah. China is now in it.
Chinese are now at 20 kilometers from Hanoi. Vietmin is furious. His troops are even lacking supplies and fuel due to this unscheduled attack, and the South Vietnamese army is disbanding. Part of his staff believed that they could not hold against the Chinese and it would be better to retreat and organize a defensive line south of the 17th parallel. Vietmin has other plans. June 11th, 1960. Vietmin requests to Berlin the authorization to deploy nuclear weapons, as in our timeline MacArthur did after the Chinese attack in Korea in 1950. Truman relieved MacArthur after this request. Hitler has a different approach to the problem. After a brief consultation with Himmler and his generals, he authorizes the use of nuclear weapons. June 12, 1960. At the dawn, the heavy bombers HE-507 leave the air bases in Germany. The Kriegsmarine in 1960 already has ballistic missile submarines, the Type 23rd, 7,000 tons, 150 meters long, capable to launch 16 missiles with through nuclear 250 kiloton warheads, with a range of 5,000 kilometers. Other nukes are launched using the V-4. A total of 28 nukes are launched on cities, air bases, troop concentrations, communication hubs, depots. The genie is out of the bottle.
Yeah. 28 nukes. They launched 28. I know it's not real. I know it's like alternate timeline stuff, but whoa. You think that would really happen? I'm willing to bet it probably would. Yeah. I could believe it. Oh. That's a lot, though.
The genie is out of the bottle.
The world is horrified. The anti-war movements gain strength in the United States, Europe, and even in Germany. The American President MacArthur protests, however he don't care that much if the Chinese and the Germans destroy each other. China justifies its entry into the war as a response to German bombers that violated Chinese airspace on various occasions. Mao affirms that the Germans are using nukes if they were just any other weapon. They are as barbaric as the Japanese Imperial Army and must be pushed off the Asian continent. They can't retaliate. The first Chinese nuclear test will be conducted only in 1964. For the Germans and their allies, China is an aggressor, having attacked the German troops in Vietnam. The Soviets agreed to send more military equipment and ammunition to China, more trucks to help deal with the extended supply lines, more heavy artillery, and even some armor. The Soviet Air Force will extend the air cover, but only over the Chinese airspace. Khrushchev can't admit that he is delighted. The Germans are using their precious nuclear weapons in Vietnam rather than saving them for Europe, a much greater prize than an impoverished third world country, as was Vietnam at the time. If the Chinese win, it will be a huge defeat for the Germans. If the Chinese lose, Mao would be even more dependent on Moscow, so the Soviets win either way. Khrushchev contemplates letting the Chinese retaliate with a nuke of their own, perhaps at one of the major ports in South Vietnam. But better let the Chinese to bleed more. It will be easier to take Vietnam under their sphere of influence. The atomic bombing creates serious troubles for the Chinese to supply their forces in Vietnam, and send reinforcements. The radioactive fallout zones cut off most of the access to Vietnam from China, but, on the field, the atomic bombings had less effect than expected. The Chinese forces are mostly light infantry units, less dependent on supplies and infrastructures, and the relatively primitive nature of the logistic in Indochina works against the effectiveness of the atomic bombings. The Chinese send more and more men to replace the losses. They never lacked infantry. The South Vietnamese prisoners of war are forced to repair the nuclear damages, and to clear out a path through nuclear radiation. The Chinese were already using PALs to repair bombed-out railways and airfields. However, in the short run, the Chinese capability to fight in the Vietnamese front is reduced. They had logistical problems even before the bombings. Whitman launched an offensive on the whole front. The Germans largely control the sky over Vietnam. Soldiers, tanks and material are continued dispatched directly from the port of Hamburg. By late May, at Saigon, are landed some 500 tanks battle-ready. The Chinese armor forces in Vietnam consist in 1,000 of an upgraded version of the Soviet T-34-85. The Type 59, a 36-tons tank, copy of the Soviet T-54, is already in service, but with low numbers. Nothing that can remotely match the Germans' tanks. For a week, severe fighting raged as the Chinese tried to block the German and South Vietnamese advance. On 22nd of June, however, the Chinese withdraw, losing most of the tanks and much of the artillery. Whitman wants to extend the war into China before the arrival of the bulk of the Soviet and American helps, but Hitler orders caution. The war with China is more than enough for the moment. While the German economy is robust, it's getting difficult to support a long and huge military effort, so far from their bases. But Whitman continues the advance. Yen Bay, Tai Win, Cam Pha. After he entered in Lang Son, 10 kilometers from the Chinese border, Hitler orders to relieve Whitman from command. The new commander of the Wehrmacht forces in Vietnam is Herney Joseph Fonet. He is a French. He was born in Setsuriet in 1919, but during the Second World War volunteered for the Waffen-SS, fighting in the Charlemagne Division in Poland and Belarus. After the war, he remained in the German army, becoming one of Hitler's most trusted generals. His first order is to retire the troops and organize a defensive line 100 kilometers away from the Chinese border. The second order is the launch of other 2 nukes, just to keep the Chinese guessing. Then, he asks for a ceasefire. The Chinese government is determined to get revenge no matter what the cost, and reject the ceasefire. Mao is still convinced of the invincibility of the Chinese armed forces after the successful advance of May. On 19th of July, 400,000 Chinese start another offensive, but it turns into severe losses. On 30th of July, the Chinese start a second offensive in the west, where the difficult terrain make hard for the Germans to deploy all their firepower. After initial success, they are halted and repulsed over the following days. The Chinese are unable to keep the front lines supplied. Beyond the damages of the nukes, the Germans keep the air supremacy. Almost half of the Luftwaffe is now in Vietnam. Wang Zhen flies at Beijing several times to convince Mao to start negotiations, explaining the difficulties faced by Chinese forces. The German forces, after earlier defeats, proved much harder to infiltrate by Chinese infantry than they had been in previous weeks. Chinese forces have already lost a third of their front-line combat strength. At the end, Mao agreed with his general. He's highly pragmatic. He knows that the expulsion of the German forces from Vietnam is impossible. Meanwhile, the Germans use nukes as nuts. Neither side will be able to achieve a victory in the near future, and they will probably weaken each other considerably, for the happiness of Americans and Soviets.
Yeah. I bet.
August the 22nd, 1960, the negotiation for a ceasefire begins. The two sides continue to trade artillery fire all along the front, the German-led forces possessing a large firepower advantage over the Chinese forces. On the 1st of October 1960, all combat activities are officially suspended. On the 27th of October 1960, Liu Shaoqi and Himmler, along with the Vietnamese president Ngo Dinh Diem, signed the Berlin Peace Accords. This officially ends the Vietnam War. It lasted from the 2nd of March 1960 to the 1st of October 1960. 50,000 Chinese troops are allowed to remain in North Vietnam, 40 kilometers from the border, creating a buffer zone that the Chinese needed. Mao can be satisfied. He supported the intervention not to save North Vietnam. Other than an alliance of convenience during the war, the Vietnamese and Chinese never exactly liked each other. One of his goals was to improve his prestige inside the communist international community, fighting what was viewed as the strongest anti-communist power in the world. The war exacted an enormous human cost, more than 2 million of whom were Chinese, the majority of whom were civilians, but the nuclear bombings will cause disease and birth defects for decades. 600,000 Vietnamese soldiers and civilians died, and around 30,000 Germans. War crimes were committed by both sides and included rape, massacre of civilians, bombings of civilian targets, the use of torture and murder of prisoners of war. However, it's a war crime only if you lose, so only the North Vietnamese will be persecuted. The Vietnam War is over. Vietnam is united under Ngo Diem. But the story does not end here. The German nuclear arsenal is now depleted. Hitler never wanted to invest too many resources on the nukes, so despite the high quality of the German nukes, their quantity was always low. Some of the best Wehrmacht units, half of the Luftwaffe, and a consistent part of the Kriegsmarine are in Vietnam, 2 oceans far from the Vaterland. November 1960, 8 Soviet armies with 6 million men are moving to the Polish border. Washington and London announced that they will blockade the Atlantic and Mediterranean Sea to impede further hostility in Indochina. A Japanese fleet moves towards the South China Sea.
Yeah, so this is the consequences, right? This is the consequence of what the Germans have done. The nukes and all that, you know? That give the Allies and the Soviets everything they needed, pretty much, to invade. Yeah. Not to mention they've depleted a lot of their nukes, or all of their nukes. And the forces are considerably weakened, and whatever's left is, like, a big chunk of it is far away. You know? So it's going to be very hard for them to fight this one.
A Japanese fleet moves towards the South China Sea. The Cold War is about to end.
I didn't know that was nearly the end of the video, but there it is. Okay, that was interesting. Like I said, you know, I have no idea how much of this would actually happen. Obviously, it's just guesswork, and they're just telling a story, you know. But let me know, those of you who know more about this stuff than I ever will. Like I said before, let me know, what do you think? Would this have actually happened in this way, or do you think there were flaws in their reasoning and their ideas? Definitely an interesting concept. And this is just entertainment. Yeah, it's just entertainment. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. Hope you did too. Hope you liked the reaction. And until next time, I am out of here.